Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the brutal massacre in the Natchez slave quarters of 1876 that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. History is not always written in ink. Far more often, it is written in blood, etched into a canvas of earth and memory that stubbornly refuses to forget. On the night of June 13th, 1876, in the sweltering, mosquito-thick hills near Natchez, Mississippi, one such chapter was carved not with a pen, but with the cold, hard steel of long overdue vengeance. This was the night that 47 souls, men and women who were legally free but remained shackled in every way that mattered, rose up as a single, terrifying entity. In the suffocating darkness before dawn, they executed a judgment so precise, so methodical, it left 4 plantation overseers dismembered and the master of the estate. A man who believed himself a king, begging for a life he had never granted to others. But do not mistake this for a simple rebellion. A rebellion is chaos. A riot is a firestorm of raw, undirected fury. What transpired at the Eden Novo plantation was something far more chilling. It was a tribunal held in shadows, a sentencing whispered on the humid night air, and an execution carried out with the steady hands of surgeons. This is not the story of a mere uprising. It is a harrowing account of a tipping point. It is a testament to how extreme, unrelenting oppression can alchemize human suffering into a terrifyingly righteous weapon. This is the story of a night when the blood of the oppressors was finally forced to soak the same soil that had drunk the sweat, the tears, and the silent screams of the oppressed for generations. It is a story that asks a terrible, enduring question. When all avenues for justice are barred, what dark thing, patient and unforgiving, crawls from its grave to take its place? To truly comprehend the anatomy of such a meticulous and brutal act, you must first immerse yourself in the world that forged it, the suffocating, hermetically sealed crucible of the Eden Novo plantation. The name itself, New Eden, was a monument to its founder's arrogance, a blasphemous irony that tasted like ash in the mouths of those who toiled there. Sprawling across thousands of acres of sugarcane that grew monstrously tall in the Mississippi heat, the plantation was a sovereign nation of suffering. It was separated from the nascent American nation not just by miles of dense, unforgiving wilderness, but by the absolute, godlike will of its proprietor, Colonel Horace Whitmore. Here, the laws of the United States were a faint, irrelevant whisper. The only law was the crack of the lash. And the only scripture that mattered was the Colonel's leather-bound ledger of profit and punishment. The year was 1876. A full decade and more had passed since the cannons of the Civil War fell silent, on paper, in the hallowed halls of Washington. The great sin of slavery had been excised from the nation's soul. But history, especially in the remote corners of the Deep South, has a powerful inertia. It clings on, refusing to die, for the men and women of Eden Novo. The Emancipation Proclamation was a cruel fiction, a distant fairy tale told in a language they could no longer afford to believe. Slavery hadn't been abolished, it had merely been rebranded. It now wore the more palatable masks of sharecropping, a system of permanent debt that chained families to the land more securely than iron and convict leasing. The state's new black codes ensured that any black man could be arrested for the most trivial of offenses. such as vagrancy, and leased out to plantations like Eden Novo, creating a new, disposable workforce. Surrounding this self-contained hell was the ever-present, ambient terror of the Night Riders, the nascent Ku Klux Klan, whose ghostly patrols served as a constant reminder that even if one could somehow escape the plantation, a wider, just as hateful world awaited them. Eden Novo was not just a workplace, it was a prison, and its walls were built from fear. The very atmosphere of the plantation was a physical, palpable weight. The air, thick and sweet with the smell of boiling sugar, was perpetually tainted by the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke from the branding fires. Silence here was never peaceful. It was the tense, coiled quiet of a held breath. The agonizing pause between the overseer's raised hand and the devastating impact of the whip. The soundscape was a liturgy of despair, the low, constant hum of chains, an ever-present metallic ghost in the air, the rhythmic crack of the lash that spoke of torn flesh, and the soft, desperate weeping that the thick cabin walls were meant to swallow, but never truly could. This was a world meticulously engineered to pulverize the human spirit, to grind personhood into a fine, compliant dust. But its architects, in their infinite arrogance, had made a fatal miscalculation. They failed to understand a fundamental law of nature. When you subject a soul to enough pressure, it does not always shatter. Sometimes it crystallizes into something unbreakable, hard, sharp, and capable of cutting through the very hands that sought to crush it. And in the deepest shadows of Eden Novo, there were those who had learned not only to see in the dark, but to master it. Isaac Freeman was one such man. He was a figure carved from silence and observation. Every dusk, as the oppressive heat of the day finally began to recede, he would sit on the same cold, smooth stone a few yards from the whipping post. He did not choose the spot for its comfort, but for its clarity. It was the heart of Eden Novo's pain, and from there, he bore witness to everything. He was a silent chronicler of suffering, a living ledger of every crime committed under the colonel's reign. He memorized the cadence of a man's limp after a beating, the duration of a defiant stare before it was broken, the subtle tremor in a hand reaching for a gourd of water. He remembered his wife, Elara. He didn't just remember her face. He remembered the feel of her hand slipping from his as the traders dragged her away. He remembered her last word to him, a desperate, hissed, "Live." That memory did not fuel a fiery, outward rage. Instead, it had cooled over the years into something far more dangerous, a cold, dense core of purpose. His silence was a weapon he was sharpening every single day. If Isaac was the plantation's memory, then old Elias was its soul, blind for 2 decades. His clouded eyes saw nothing of the physical world, but his other senses had sharpened into something almost supernatural. He sat in the corner of his cabin, a creature of stillness, endlessly rubbing a string of beads carved from the bones of a mule. He was the keeper of stories, the conduit to the ancestors, the one who listened not to the words of men, but to the whispers of the earth itself. He felt the shift in the seasons not by the light, but by the smell of the soil. He knew a storm was coming by the vibration in the floorboards. And lately, he had felt a new tremor, a deep, unsettling vibration that had nothing to do with the weather. One evening, as Isaac sat on a stone, watching the last vestiges of light bleed from the sky, Elias's papery voice drifted through the twilight. It was barely a whisper, yet It cut through the chirping of the crickets. The earth's talking again. "Isaac," he said, his head cocked, his blind eyes seeming to look directly at the ground beneath his feet. "She's tired of drinking sorrow. She's saying, 'It's time.'" Isaac did not reply. Words were inadequate for the cold understanding that passed between them. He simply tightened his grip on a heavy, rusted iron spike he kept wrapped in cloth beneath his bedding straw. A tool that had long ago ceased to be for mending fences. But the final sign, the undeniable portent that confirmed Elias's prophecy, came not from a whisper, but from the very ground itself. A week prior, a young man named Samuel was whipped to death by Reuben, the most notoriously cruel of the overseers. It was a death, like many others, brutal, unjust, and unrecorded. Isaac was one of the men tasked with digging the grave, a shallow, anonymous hole at the edge of the cane field. He remembered the sickening thud of Samuel's body hitting the bottom of the pit. He covered it with the dark, heavy soil. Another secret for the land to keep. But 2 days later, Isaac passed the spot and froze. Something was wrong. Pushing up from the freshly turned earth was a single pale root. It was thicker than a man's thumb, twisted and gnarled as an old man's hand. It didn't grow sideways or down. It grew straight up, a crooked, skeletal finger pointing accusingly toward a silent heaven. It was unnatural. It was an answer. It was a declaration. Old Elias was right. The land had finally started speaking, and its first word was a promise of vengeance. That single, twisted root was not an omen. It was a command. In that moment, the years of silent observation of meticulously catalogued injustices coalesced within Isaac Freeman into a singular, cold point of certainty. The time for watching was over. The earth itself had rendered its verdict. And now, it fell to the hands of men to carry out the sentence. That same night, a signal, subtle and known only to the initiated, rippled through the suffocating dark of the Eden Nova quarters. It was not a word, but a sound, the specific, triple call of a barred owl. A note of profound loneliness that was answered from the far side of the cabins a moment later. It was the summons. They gathered not in a cabin, but below one, in a long-forgotten root cellar beneath a dilapidated smokehouse. The space smelled of cured meat, damp earth, and generations of secrets. One by one, then in pairs. 47 shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness and descended a set of rickety wooden steps into the flickering gloom of a single tallow lantern. Here, for the first time, there were no masters, no overseers. There were only faces, illuminated by the unsteady light, faces carved with the unique hieroglyphs of their private suffering. There were old men with backs permanently stooped, young women with eyes that held the ancient weariness of their grandmothers, and youths who had never known a single day without the taste of fear in their mouths. For a long moment, the only sound was the strained creak of the floorboards above and the heavy, collective breathing of people who had risked everything just to be in this room. A man named Jacob, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle from a poorly healed break, spoke first. His voice was a raw whisper, yet it filled the silence. "He killed Samuel. For nothing. We cannot keep burying our children." A wave of murmurs, of pained, frustrated agreement, washed through the cellar. Another, a woman named Sarah, spoke of the endless work, the dwindling rations, the gnawing, soul-deep exhaustion that left no room for hope. The air grew thick with shared grief and a burgeoning, desperate rage. There were whispers of running north, of fighting back with cane knives and stones in a final, hopeless blaze of glory. Then, A new voice cut through the despair, not loud, but sharp and clear as shattered glass. Rage is a fire that consumes itself. It will not burn down the big house. All eyes turned to Clara. She was younger than most in the room, but the sorrow she carried had forged her a chilling authority. The sale of her baby sister and the lynching of her husband had not broken her. They had tempered her grief into a blade of pure, cold logic. "They are strong," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the lantern light. "But they are arrogant. They are cruel, but they are predictable. Their power is built on a foundation of habit, and habit is a weakness we can exploit." She spoke with terrifying clarity. She spoke of Reuben's nightly drunkenness, of Jeb's superstitious fear of the swamp after dark, of Miles's solitary patrols along the western fence line. She had been watching, just as Isaac had, but where he saw the crimes, she saw the patterns. She saw the vulnerabilities. Her words masterfully shifted the energy in the room, guiding it away from a desperate, explosive heat and toward a focused, cold intensity. She gave their anger a structure. She gave it a purpose. It was then that Isaac finally spoke. He had remained a silent, looming presence in the corner, absorbing every word. When he spoke, his voice was low, flat, and devoid of the passionate anger that had filled the room moments before. It was the voice of a conclusion reached long ago in the desolate quiet of his own heart. She is right. We will not be a fire that burns out in a single night. He paused, his gaze falling on each person, forging a silent, unbreakable pact. We will be the rot that consumes a tree from the inside. We will be the rust that eats the chain link by link. There will be no grand battle. There will be only subtraction. He held up his hands, calloused and scarred from decades of labor. The physical proof of all that had been taken from him. They have taken our children, our spouses, our names, our very breath. Now, we take from them. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting like chips of obsidian in the lantern light, and delivered the oath that would bind them all, a creed written in the ink of their collective suffering. The justice they have denied us, we will provide for ourselves, the same way they did it to us, bone for bone, mark for mark. The oath settled over the 47, not with the fervor of a battle cry, but with the profound, terrifying solemnity of a sacrament. The decision had been made. Now came the liturgy of their vengeance. A few nights later, they gathered again, this time in a place far more sacred and secret than the root cellar, a deep hollow, shrouded by ancient cypress trees whose hanging moss absorbed sound and light, creating a natural cathedral of silence. This was no longer a meeting to debate a course of action. This was a court, convened under the supreme authority of unbearable memory. Isaac stood in the center of the circle, not as a leader, but as the first among equals. "Before we act," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be drawn from the earth itself, "we must name the debt. Justice must have a name." And so they began, one by one. They stepped forward into the faint moonlight that filtered through the canopy. And they spoke the truth. This was the true unveiling, the unburdening of secrets that had been carried in scarred flesh and tormented minds for years. Secrets that festered in the darkness. Abner, the old ox handler, stepped forward first. "Reuben," he said, his voice trembling with a rage that was 17 years old. "He tied my wife, Martha, to the wagon axle for spilling a bucket of feed. She never walked right again. For 17 years. I've watched her suffer every single day. I name that debt." He stepped back, and a young woman, hardly more than a girl, took his place. "Jeb," she whispered, the name itself a curse on her lips. He poured hot lard on my cousin's back because he tripped while serving dinner. My cousin was 12 years old. He screamed for a week. I named that debt. The accusations continued, a relentless, heartbreaking litany of casual cruelty. They spoke of Miles, the quiet overseer, whose punishments were never loud but were always cold, precise, and often fatal. They spoke of his method of disciplining workers in the far fields, where the endless rows of cane could swallow a person's screams whole. They even named Miss Hattie, the colonel's wife, a woman who never swung a whip herself, but whose faint, satisfied smile as she watched the punishments was its own unique and terrible form of poison. Each name spoken was a stone cast into the dark, still pond of their collective grief, and the ripples were the shared, grim understanding of what had to be done. Clara was the last to step forward. She held a small, frayed piece of cloth, stained and faded with time. "This was my sister's," she said, her voice tight as a wire. "It is the only thing I have left of her. The man who sold her, the one who laughed as he took the coins, was Colonel Horace Whitmore himself. I want him to feel her bones breaking, one by one. I name that debt." The trial was complete. The sentences were now understood. The pressure in the hollow was no longer just emotional, it was tactical. The conversation shifted from grief to logistics. "Reuben is the muscle, but he is a fool," Clara stated, her tone now that of a field marshal. "He drinks himself into a stupor every day after the noon meal. His pride takes him to the forge alone, to boast among the tools of his trade." All eyes turned to Josie, a boy of 16 whose arm was a road map of scars from an accident at the sugar vats. He was small, moved like a whisper, and had long ago learned the art of being invisible. "Josie," Isaac commanded softly, "you will watch him, know his every step, when he is alone. When he is drunkest, you will be our eyes." Abner, the ox handler, then spoke with a grim practicality. "The trough's behind the stables. The dung is deep. I can hide blades there, wrapped in oilcloth. The dogs will never catch the scent." The plan began to stitch itself together in the darkness, each person contributing a unique and vital piece of their hidden knowledge. Clara herself would handle the more subtle aspects. "The kitchen girls and I," she explained, her voice low and conspiratorial. "We know the wild bitter root that grows by the creek. It's a poison the masters don't know. Not enough to kill, but a few drops in their bread. It slows the heart. It fogs the mind. It will make them slow. It will make them weak." As the plan solidified, a chilling finality settled over the group. Elias, who had been sitting silently on a fallen log, spoke a final, chilling prophecy into the night. He turned his blind face towards Isaac. "You have heard a man scream," he whispered, "but have you ever heard a chain scream?" Isaac shook his head. Elias offered a thin, toothless smile that was anything but reassuring. "You will," he said. "You will hear it scream on the day that it finally breaks." Noon in Natchez hit like a blacksmith's hammer. The heat shimmered in viscous waves off the packed dirt, and the flies danced in lazy, drunken circles over sweat and silence. It was the hour of rest, the hour of vulnerability. In the big house, the overseers were well into their cups, their bellies full of pork and rum, their arrogance dulled by liquor. But in the forge at the edge of the main yard, there was no rest, there was only heat, and there was waiting. Isaac stood before the anvil, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on hot iron echoing like a funeral bell. This place was a monument to his own pain. It was here he had lost 3 fingernails to a red-hot rod because he'd blinked too slowly for Reuben's liking. It was here he had spent years hammering his rage day after day, folding it into the steel, cooling it in the water, burying it deep inside the coals and iron. Now, it was time to draw it back out. Josie had given the signal an hour before. A single, sharp whistle, like that of a red-winged blackbird, from the top of the hayloft. It meant Reuben had had his customary 2 heavy drinks of sugarcane liquor. It meant he was now taking his half-dip of snuff. It meant he was slow, loose, and dangerously confident. The moment Reuben's heavy shadow fell across the forge's entrance, Isaac had already turned his back, pretending to be absorbed in his work. The long, heavy iron tongs lay ready on the anvil, not for shaping metal, but for breaking flesh. Their edges had been secretly filed down to bite deep. "Ain't you done with that wheel yet, boy?" Reuben barked, his voice thick with drunken authority. Isaac didn't answer. He just kept hammering, the cadence steady, hypnotic. Clang, clang, clang. Reuben, annoyed by the lack of immediate submission, strode closer. He reached for a heavy chain hanging on the wall, likely to punctuate his next command with a casual, brutal threat. That was when the world shifted, as fast as a striking snake. As sudden as a bolt of lightning, Isaac turned. In one fluid, practiced motion, he seized the iron tongs, gripped Reuben by the thick collar of his shirt, and slammed him backward against the forge's heavy timber support post. The impact was hard enough to rattle Reuben's teeth and drive the air from his lungs. Before a scream could form, Isaac acted. He didn't use the sharpened points. He used the other end, the one still glowing with the dull, residual heat from the coals. He shoved the hot end of the tongs hard into Reuben's side, between his ribs, not enough to kill, but just enough to remind. "Bert's a sick cup of yourselves, just filthy." Dector crowed, his voice a low, guttural sound Reuben had never heard before. "That's what my brother felt when you burned his leg? He was 13. Reuben writhed, his face a mask of shock and agony, his mind too clouded by liquor to comprehend the impossible reality of the situation. While he was stunned, Isaac moved with a terrifying efficiency, looping a rope around his arms, kicking his legs out from under him, and slamming him to the dirt floor. No one heard. The forge was loud, and the rest of the world was in a drunken stupor. Isaac knelt over the gasping man. He took Reuben's right hand, the hand that held the whip, and slowly, deliberately, broke the first finger. A sickening snap echoed in the forge. Then the wrist. "You broke us," Isaac said, his voice cold and calm as he applied the pressure. "Every day, every hour. Now you feel what it is to be broken." The bones snapped like dry twigs. One, then another. The leg followed. And when Reuben finally found his voice, when he finally began to beg, truly and pathetically begged for his life, Isaac leaned in close, his face inches from the overseer's. "We," he whispered, his breath hot with the forge's fire, "ain't begging no more." He left the body in the deep coal bin, covering it with layers of ash and dust. By the time the others would come looking, Reuben would simply be gone, vanished. Another soul swallowed by the insatiable plantation. That night, a profound quiet reigned in the quarters. No one asked questions. No one spoke of what they knew. But as Isaac passed Clara in the darkness between the cabins, she pressed a small scrap of cloth into his hand, a token, a sign. Her eyes gleamed in the faint starlight. Her lips formed a single, silent phrase without making a sound. One down, far off in the distance, thunder rolled across the clear, star-filled sky. The first crack of the storm had sounded, and the rain of blood was only just beginning. The morning after Reuben's vanishing dawned hot and unnervingly still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In the big house, Colonel Horace Whitmore sat on his veranda, a silver cup of chicory brew held tight in his hand, but the rich aroma brought no comfort. An unfamiliar silence had settled over Eden Novo, a quiet that was not peaceful, but predatory. Reuben, a man as brutally predictable as the sunrise, had missed his morning report. His cabin was untouched, his whips still hung in neat, cruel rows on the wall. A perfunctory search was ordered, but the hunting dogs, beasts trained to track men through the densest swamp, refused to approach the forge. They whined and paced, tails tucked low, their animal senses detecting a profound wrongness that the men could not yet see. This was the first piece of evidence, not one that could be presented in a court of law, but one that spoke in a primal, chilling language of terror. Whitmore's irritation quickly curdled into a cold, gnawing unease. He doubled the patrols, his orders sharp with a new, brittle edge. He called for Jeb, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his slovenly nature, and commanded him to find Reuben, or find someone to blame. That afternoon, 3 young men were tied to the posts in the main yard. They were chosen at random. Their innocence was irrelevant. Jeb paced before them, his voice slick with menace, promising a pain that would wring confessions from them for sins they'd never imagined. It was a familiar theater of power, designed to break the will of the many by shattering the bodies of a few. But this time, the audience had changed. From the kitchens, Clara watched, her hands never ceasing their work, her expression a perfect mask of impassive submission. She knew Jeb's habits intimately. She knew of his late afternoon ritual, a cup of strong coffee laced with 2 fingers of bourbon, a habit he believed sharpened his senses for the evening's cruelties. As Jeb later sat in the colonel's study, gloating over the day's interrogations, it was Clara herself who brought him the tray. Her hands were steady, her head was bowed. She placed the cup on the desk beside his pistol and backed away, a ghost in her own home. Jeb, lost in his own importance, never looked up. He never saw the faint, oily sheen on the coffee's surface, nor did he taste the bitter root until his chest began to tighten, his thoughts clouding over as if a fog had rolled directly into his skull. He reached for his pistol, but his fingers felt clumsy, thick, disconnected from his will. He tried to call for help, but the guards were out on another fruitless search for Reuben. That was when the shadows in the study detached themselves from the walls and took human form. Abner, the old ox handler, struck first, a heavy mallet, swung with the power of a man who had spent a lifetime controlling beasts, shattered Jeb's kneecap. The overseer collapsed with a choked, wet scream. Then came Isaac. He moved with the calm, cold precision of the forge, his face an emotionless mask. He did not rush. He did not shout. He simply began to dismantle the man, the arms that had beaten the innocent, the fingers that had pointed in accusation, the jaw that had spat so much hatred. When it was over, Jeb was no longer a man, just a broken collection of flesh and bone. They dragged his body out through the servants' entrance and into the waiting, hungry darkness. 2 were gone. The silence on the plantation grew heavier, deeper, charged with an unspoken, terrifying knowledge. The colonel's paranoia bloomed into full-blown terror. He locked himself in his house after sundown. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that this was not random. This was a conspiracy. This was an insurgency. His third and final overseer, a quiet, cold man named Miles, shared his fear. Miles was not a drunk like Reuben or a slob like Jeb. He was a creature of rigid routine, finding a fragile safety in predictability. His most cherished ritual was a solitary walk every Thursday at dusk, along the path behind the cornrows, to check the fence traps. He said it cleared his mind. That Thursday, the conspirators were waiting. The plan was a masterwork of psychological manipulation. near the old, dry well, a place long rumored to be a repository for the plantation's darkest secrets, they set their trap. A young woman named Rachel, known for her quick wits, played the part of a victim. Her ankle supposedly twisted, her cries for help just loud enough to be plausible. Miles, though cautious, was drawn in by the irresistible prospect of asserting his authority. He approached her, his hand on his whip, his eyes scanning for trouble. He saw the woman bent in pain. He did not see Elijah, a man as tall and silent as a pine tree, emerge from the brush behind him. He did not feel the leather cord until it was already tightening around his neck, biting deep and silencing him instantly. Isaac stepped out last, his face calm, his eyes holding a terrible personal weight. They dragged Miles to the lip of the well. They didn't beat him. They didn't break his bones. They simply laid him there, bound and gagged, and forced him to stare down into the black, silent maw before they pushed him over. Isaac leaned in close, his voice a whisper that was for Miles alone. "This is for Eliza, 1869. She was with child." The flicker of horrified recognition in Miles's wide eyes was the only confession Isaac needed. They rolled him into the darkness. There was a sickening thud, then an absolute, final silence. They covered the well with the old boards, then dirt, then a broken wagon wheel, making it look like another pile of forgotten junk. But they knew, and the earth knew, what lay beneath. The pattern was now complete. The evidence was irrefutable. The plantation's enforcers had been systematically erased. Only the king remained on his throne of fear. For 3 days, Colonel Horace Whitmore did not leave the big house. He existed in a state of suspended terror, drinking bourbon from dawn until dusk, starting at every creak of the floorboards. His pistol his only companion. The plantation, his kingdom, had ceased to function. The sugar vats cooled. The cane stood uncut. The remaining servants moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that he now recognized as something other than obedience. It was patience. He was a prisoner in his own home. Besieged by an enemy, he could not see an army of ghosts that wore the faces of his own slaves. On the third night, they came for him. It was not a violent, chaotic assault. It was a silent, coordinated infiltration. 5 men, led by Isaac, slipped into the house through the kitchen. A path Clara had ensured was clear. They moved through the grand hallways like spirits, their bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. They knew this house as well as the colonel did not its drawing rooms and parlors, but its hidden passages, its weak points, its secret soul. They found him in his study, not a formidable tyrant, but a pathetic, drunken wreck. He was sitting in his high-backed leather chair, rambling to the portraits of his ancestors on the walls, polishing the pistol he had never once fired in true anger. He didn't even look up when the door creaked open. "About time, Jeb," he slurred, mistaking the shadows for a man long dead. "Fetch me another bottle." Then he saw Isaac's face in the lamplight, and the colonel's world finally and completely fractured. Isaac didn't say a word. He just raised the heavy, rusted butt of an old rifle and brought it down on the colonel's head. When Whitmore awoke, the world was a spinning vortex of pain and flickering light. The smell of his own fine brandy was replaced by the familiar, hated smells of the quarter's wood smoke, sweat, and dirt. They had dragged him from his palace and into the heart of their own world. He was tied to the whipping post, the central pillar of his reign, the altar upon which he had sacrificed so many. A ring of lanterns was lit, casting a stark, theatrical glow, ensuring that even the darkness could not look away. The 47 surrounded him. There were no masks, no secrets now, just the faces scarred, burned, weary, but terrifyingly strong of the people whose names he had never bothered to learn. Their eyes held a perfect, collective memory of everything. Clara stepped forward, her face illuminated by the lantern she held. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice calm and clear. He blinked, blood and liquor clouding his vision. You're just a house girl." A sharp, stinging slap from Rachel, standing beside him, cracked his jaw. "Try again," she commanded. Clara smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "No," she said softly. "I am the child of the woman you sold for 2 goats and a jug of molasses. I am the scream your walls still echo at night. I am the nightmare that is, at last, real." Elias was guided forward by Abner, his blind eyes seeming to see more than any of them. His ancient, trembling hands reached out and touched the coarse rope that bound the colonel to the post. "Feel that?" he whispered. "This is the same rope you used to hang my brother. I braided it myself. I wanted it to be strong." The colonel struggled, cursed, spat a cornered animal, revealing its true nature. Isaac finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "You always said the law of this land was the whip, the post, and the fire." He stepped closer, into the ring of light. "Well, Colonel, here is your trial." It was not a confession beaten out of him. It was a truth forced upon him. They made him listen. Abner, whose father was drowned in the creek for refusing to work on a Sunday. Rachel, whose breasts were seared with a hot poker for nursing her own crying baby before the mistresses. Josie, who still walked with a limp because his bones had never healed right. Each voice was another nail driven into the coffin of the old order. They held up their scars as evidence. They spoke the names of the dead as witnesses. And as he looked into the endless sea of eyes, at the faces of the people who had survived the world he had built, something inside him finally broke. The dam of his arrogance and denial burst, and the ugly, putrid truth spilled out. "Yes," he wept, his words stumbling out like vomit. "I ordered it. All of it. I own them. It was my right." No one cheered. There was no glory in his collapse. There was only a heavy, ugly, and necessary reality. Isaac leaned down until his face was inches from the colonel's. "No," he said, his voice a quiet, final correction. "You had power. That ain't the same as right." Then Clara walked up, holding the same branding iron used on the plantation's livestock, its tip glowing a malevolent, hungry red from the fire. She looked him dead in the eye. "This mark," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of generations of pain. "It is not yours to give any more." And she pressed it to his chest. He screamed then, a high, piercing shriek like a dying hog, but the sound did not echo. The land, it seemed, just swallowed it whole. The sky turned red long before the first flame touched the cane. It was an unnatural dusk, a bloody omen painted across the heavens, the kind of warning that makes birds flee and trees tremble. Isaac stood at the edge of the vast sugarcane field, Clara at his side. Behind them, the remaining 47 held torches, fashioned from cane stalks wrapped in cloth and soaked in lard. The flickering light danced across faces that had been carved by time, by rage, and now, by a terrible, resolute purpose. The colonel was still tied to the post, a broken, wheezing testament to a fallen empire. But they were no longer there for him. Tonight was for the fields. Tonight was for the land itself. Every lash," Isaac said, his voice thick, his throat tight with emotion. "Every bone cracked, every child taken. All of it, it was all for this." He raised his torch high, the flame licking at the darkness. The others followed suit, creating a ring of fire in the heart of the night. "This land has drunk our blood for too long," Clara said, her voice ringing with a strange, fierce clarity. "Tonight, it drinks something else." She stepped forward first, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. She thrust a torch into the base of a dry, waiting cane stalk. The flame did not hesitate. It leaped with a hungry roar, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a century. Then Rachel lit the second row, Elijah the third. In moments, the fire was no longer a collection of individual torches, but a single living entity. It ran. It did not crawl or smolder. It ran like a spirit unleashed, screaming through the fields. A tidal wave of orange and yellow, twisting through the 7-foot stalks. Its fiery claws grabbing at the night sky. The cane did not burn quietly. It howled. It popped and hissed, each stalk exploding like a musket shot. A sound that mimicked the crack of the whip that had so often echoed through it. It was as if the fields themselves were crying out in a final, agonizing release for every bag that had ever been broken among them. From the big house, the flames looked like a biblical curse, a divine judgment, a red halo of damnation rising over centuries of forced silence. The colonel, still conscious, began to scream again, not from any physical pain, but from the soul-deep horror of knowing. He was witnessing the source of his power, the object of his worship prophet, sugar, order, being melted down to ash right before his eyes. Isaac did not turn to look at him. He looked at the fire, at the beautiful, terrible destruction, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Clara leaned close, her face illuminated by the inferno. "This isn't revenge," she said. "This is freedom, on fire." As if summoned by her words, the wind shifted, carrying the thick, acrid smoke across the quarters, into the big house, and up the hill toward the neighboring plantations. By dawn, the entire cane field was gone. Nothing remained but a vast, black carpet of soot and smoldering stock bones, still steaming in the humid morning air. The sugar vats were cold. The barrels stood empty. The immense wealth of Eden Novo had been utterly and completely erased, swallowed by fire and fury. And when the first boots of the Mississippi State Militia hit the soil of Natchez 5 days later, they were not responding to a crime. They were responding to a declaration of war. The Natchez Chronicle would call it a savage uprising of unprecedented brutality. Official military dispatches would later describe it as a coordinated insurrection against property and civil order. But in the smoldering hills above what was once Eden Novo, they called it by its true name, survival. The hunt was on. The war that followed the fire was not one of pitched battles and military formations. It was a war of whispers and shadows, fought in the deep, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded the ashes of Eden Novo. The 47 were no longer a unified council. They were now 3 distinct bands of guerrilla fighters, their numbers already beginning the slow, inevitable process of dwindling. They were no longer slaves seeking justice. They had been redefined by fire and blood into something more primal antibodies of the land itself, rising to purge a sickness. Isaac had seen soldiers before, but the men who marched into the hills now were different. They were armed not just with polished rifles and gleaming bayonets, but with the full, righteous fury of an empire scorned. They came to restore order, but they were utterly unprepared for an enemy that did not march in lines. An enemy that did not fear death. An enemy that had the land itself as its most powerful ally. Elijah, the tall, silent man of the forest, led a band through the treacherous swamp trails he knew better than the lines on his own hand. Rachel. Her grief for her slain family, now honed into a razor's edge, took her fighters to the ridges by the old chapel ruins. Isaac, the unwilling general, remained in the hollow where the well water ran deep and the ancient trees seemed to know their names. They did not run. They set traps. They dug deep pits covered in branches and cane husks, hung bells from old mule harnesses to signal enemy movement, and sharpened dense cypress wood into deadly spears. Historical accounts from the soldiers' own journals speak of a bewildering and terrifying campaign. They wrote of a foe that was everywhere and nowhere at once, of attacks that came not from the front, but from above and below. The Empire fought with maps and compasses. The rebels fought with memory and instinct. On the third day of the hunt, the first militia squad felled 12 men, vanished without a single shot being fired, swallowed whole by the swamp. Nerves began to fray among the soldiers. Fingers twitched on triggers. They began to see enemies in every rustling leaf and shifting shadow. In their frustration, they burned a lone cabin, believing it to be a hideout. It was just an old empty smokehouse. And that act of blind aggression was the signal Clara's group had been waiting for. Moving like ghosts through the dry patches of unburnt cane, they set their own fires, not the grand inferno of before, but smaller, strategic blazes that rose like angry spirits, screaming to the soldiers, "We are still here, and we are not done yet." The conflict devolved into a brutal, intimate series of skirmishes. One soldier stumbled into a pit trap lined with sharpened stakes. Another stepped into a snare that hoisted him screaming into the canopy. A third turned from the blinding smoke of Clara's fires, only to see Rachel's eyes, cold and wild as a hawk's. In the split second before her knife found his throat, back in Natchez, the commanding general paced his office in disbelief. "They are just slaves," he was recorded to have muttered to the mayor. "How are we losing men to field hands?" But the mayor, a man who had lived in these lands his whole life, knew better. These were not slaves, not anymore. They were shadows with names the Empire had never bothered to learn, and they were taking back the hills, one terrified soldier at a time. But their victories came at a devastating cost. The war of attrition is a war that the small can never truly win. Rachel, fierce and brilliant Rachel, was the first of the leaders to fall, caught in a volley of rifle fire while covering her group's retreat. They buried her beneath an ancient gum tree. The quiet of their grief, a stark contrast to the ferocity with which she had lived. Then came Elijah, who swung a heavy branch club with the force of a falling tree, taking 3 militiamen with him before a bayonet finally found its mark. The losses began to mount, each one a gaping wound in their dwindling fellowship. The 47 had become 30, then 20, then 13. The final stand took place in a fog-shrouded gully as the seasons began to turn. The remaining fighters were wounded, exhausted, but utterly unbroken. Isaac, a bullet wound stitched tight in his leg, led the charge with a torch in one hand and a length of chain in the other. He no longer killed to win. He killed to make them remember, to burn the cost of this land into the memory forever. Young Josie, the boy with the scarred arm, fought with a broken shovel head tied to a pole, a desperate weapon wielded with incredible courage, before he too was overwhelmed. Clara, a deep gash from a collarbone to her hip, moved through the fight like a wraith, her knife answering every rifle shot, each thrust bearing the silent name of a fallen comrade. By the time the fog lifted at dawn, the smoke had thinned, and a profound silence had fallen over the field of bodies. The militia had taken the gully, but they had lost more than 30 men to do so. Of the rebels, only Isaac and Clara were left standing, leaning against the gum tree, breathing, just barely. They had not won the war. They had not won the land. But they had won the right to exist as more than a footnote in a ledger. They had earned their legacy with fire. The Empire, as empires do, eventually declared victory. Official records state that the Natchez insurrection of 1876 was decisively crushed. The rebels slaughtered to a man. The soldiers withdrew, leaving behind a silence they mistook for peace. The newspapers printed what they were told. The mayor of Natchez stopped asking questions. The world kept moving, but in the hills above the ashes of Eden Novo, the story was not over. It was transforming. Isaac and Clara did not flee. To leave would have been a betrayal of the dead. Their war was over, but their work had just begun. With hands that were raw and fingers bloodied from stone and splintered roots, they began the sacred task of burying their own. They laid Elijah under the tall pine where he had once taught them to read the signs of the forest. They laid Josie next to Rachel near the gum tree that now served as their cathedral. No preacher prayed. No songs were sung. There was only the solemn, rhythmic scrape of the shovel against the earth, the sound of two survivors trying to put back a piece of a world that had been so violently erased. They marked the graves not with stones that could be moved or crosses that could be burned, but by carving names into the living bark of the trees. Rachel, the flame; Josie, the scout; Elijah, the hammer, beside them. They carved another Elias, the voice. These were not tombstones. They were living monuments. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. The physical scars on Isaac and Clara began to fade, but the invisible ones remained. They became the silent, solitary guardians of the haunted land. The official story of what happened to Colonel Whitmore and his overseers was never written. Their bodies were never found. Their fates relegated to a local mystery. But the true story seeped into the soil, into the water, into the very air of the place. Clara, a woman whose hands were made for both vengeance and cultivation, began to grow things in the ash-rich soil. Not cane, never cane. She planted sweet potatoes, peanuts, and corn plants that fed people, not profit. The land itself seemed to be an accomplice in their act of remembrance. When new owners eventually tried to replant the great fields, the sugarcane refused to grow as it once had. The stalks grew stunted and twisted, the sugar they produced thin and bitter, as if the soil itself refused to forget the taste of blood and fire. The story of the uprising began to transform into a local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones. They said those hills were haunted, that on still nights you could hear the pop and hiss of burning cane. They said that, if you listened hard enough, you could hear the ground whispering the names of the dead. They said a man and a woman still lived up on that ridge, aging guardians of a great and terrible secret, who spoke more to the trees than they ever did to people. One day, years later, a young woman, a granddaughter of one of the original 47 who had escaped before the final battle, made a pilgrimage back to the hills. She found Isaac, now a gray-bearded man with eyes that held the deep, quiet wisdom of the forest. She presented him with a bundle of cloth. Inside was a rusted iron spike, the very one he had kept hidden in his straw bedding so long ago, a relic passed down through her family. He took it in his hand, closed his fingers around the cold, heavy metal, and for the first time since he had lost his wife, he wept. That night, he and Clara lit 47 small candles among the memorial trees, 47 flames, each one a life, a story, a debt that had been paid in full. Not a single one went out in the wind. This was never a story about victory or defeat. It was a story about balance. It was about a debt that was called due in the most brutal of terms. The official histories will tell you of laws and proclamations, of an empire's attempt to impose order on a chaotic world, but they will not tell you of the justice that is found in the soil, in the memory of trees, in the cold calculus of bone for bone, mark for mark. They will not explain the fundamental difference between freedom written in a distant book of law and freedom earned with a torch in your own hand. Long after Isaac's own fire finally dimmed and he was laid to rest by Clara's hand beside his comrades, the land held the truth. It still knows the difference between cotton and blood, between silence and legacy. The story of Eden Novo poses a final, haunting question that echoes down through the years. What is the true nature of justice? Is it a concept debated in courthouses and written on paper? Or is it a primal, elemental force, like gravity or fire, that will, when suppressed long enough, inevitably find its own terrible, clarifying release? The world may have forgotten the names of the 47, but the hills around Natchez have not. And if you walk those woods after dark, they say the air still turns thick. They say the ground still whispers. They say that if you stop and listen, listen with more than just your ears, you can still hear the cane screaming, not from fire this time, but from memory.